Hello, welcome back to my channel. I somehow read 18 books in the month of April. I did have a week off work in the middle of the month where I did nothing else but read pretty much. And then in my most recent vlog, I did also do a 24-hour readathon, which explains why the number is so high. But in today's video, I'm going to try and give you my thoughts on all of them, tell you which ones were my favourites, which ones were the most disappointing, the ones in between. Something I want to do going forward is whilst I'm in the middle of reading a book, I want to put notes in my phone or in a notebook so that when I come to the end of the month, I have some more coherent thoughts for you. Because I feel like the second I finish a book, I have a lot to say, and then by the time it comes around to doing my monthly wrap up, I forgot every thought ever and every word that ever exists. I am very sad to report, but the most disappointing book of the month of April for me was Jackal by Erin E. Adams, which is a horror that I've been so excited to read for such a long time. And you can tell I was excited because I spent like £20 on ordering in the US cover. This is about a place called Jonestown, where over the years many young black girls have gone missing in the woods. And our main character doesn't like going back home, but she goes to visit for her friend's wedding. On the same night as the friend's wedding, the friend's daughter goes missing, and our main character begins to notice a pattern. A young girl always goes missing on a summer's night in the woods, and so she starts to try and track back through history to see where this pattern is coming from, who is doing this, what is happening. From the very beginning, I didn't love the writing style. The dialogue felt ever so slightly unrealistic. However, I was very invested in the story. It was quite tense, it was quite dark, I could feel it was leading somewhere big. And for the first two-thirds, I was liking this book, but the end, the kind of big reveal, I won't spoil anything, but for me, it felt ridiculous. It felt really silly. It kind of completely changed genre at the end. And I don't mind a horror that is ridiculous. For example, A Touch of Jen is one of my favourite books. I absolutely love that book. And it is absolutely ridiculous. It's so silly, but the whole book is in that vein. So it matches up, it makes sense, it works. Whereas for the majority of this book, it was quite serious, quite dark, quite bleak, quite tense. And then it just completely did a 180 at the end, and it just didn't match up. It was like I started reading a completely different book. I know a lot of people absolutely love this book, so I'm probably in the minority. So let me know what you did think if you have read this. Another disappointing book for me this month was Dragon Palace by Hiromi Kawakami. I gave my really detailed thoughts in my readathon. I'll give you a brief idea. This is a short story collection from this author, and this is an author whose books I've generally liked previously. And this collection is meant to be very strange and bizarre. On the blurb, it tells you the concept for every single story, and all of them sound like such a fun time. But for me, they just weren't executed very well. They were quite dull, quite forgettable, not very memorable, and really didn't live up to its synopsis. Although the concept for each of the stories sounded really exciting, the actual flesh of each of the stories was actually quite dull. And I am kind of surprised by the idea of this book for Hiromi Kawakami, because the other books I've read from Hiromi Kawakami, most of them are quite mundane, really. And this collection sounded like the opposite of that, and I guess maybe that's why it didn't work. The last story in the collection, called Seahorse, was actually my favourite, and this is about a woman who comes from the sea and starts living on land for the first time. And she has a new husband every so often. When one husband is kind of bored of her, they pass her on to the next one, and eventually she will return to the sea. And it just had such an eerie and strange atmosphere. It was set in a seaside town with rundown video rental shops, and there was a storm, and the setting of the place really added something to the story, and I think that's why I enjoyed it so much. But that is literally the only story from the collection that I properly remember. The other three books I read in my readathon were Clean, Dengue Boy, and Two Women in One. I'm not going to give thoughts on these because I gave so much detailed thoughts on them in my last video, so please go and watch that if you'd like to know more about them. I think my favourite book of April was Sky Daddy by Kate Fogg. This story is so bizarre but so tender. This is about a woman who is romantically interested in planes, and one day she would like to marry one, but to marry a plane she must die in a plane crash. Our main character works a boring job, but she gets by every day because she knows the money she earns at the end of the month will enable her to buy another flight. She becomes a bit closer to one of her colleagues at work, and she gets invited along to a gathering at a home where her and some other girls are putting vision boards together, and our main character obviously has a very specific idea in mind for her vision board, because she really wants to marry her favourite plane. And everyone notices that she's a little bit strange, and her visions start coming to fruition. And here everything just kind of spirals out of control. From the concept of this book, you would think it would just be kind of odd, but it does have some very tender moments, some very emotional moments. It really explores the compassion we can have for each other despite our differences. Our main character is semi-aware that her romantic interest is strange compared to the average person. However, she is bursting at the seams with the need to express herself and express her desires and her wants and to be accepted for who she is. And although we're not all romantically interested in planes, I think that idea is something we can all relate to in one way or another. One of the many things I love about Kate Folk's writing is her dialogue. For me, feels so realistic. One of my biggest gripes in books is when the dialogue feels very over the top and just not realistic at all. It makes me cringe, and it's one of the biggest reasons I'll DNF a book. Whereas the dialogue in Kate Folk's books is kind of awkward, but that is more like real life. We do talk awkwardly, we stutter, we don't Think Before We Speak. Out There by Kate Folk, which is her first book, which is a short story collection, is one of my favourite books of all time. So I was so highly anticipating Sky Daddy, and it did not disappoint me. And I can't wait to see what wacky stuff she releases next. Another one of my favourite books this month was You Should Have Left by Daniel Kalman, which is translated from German. This is about a man and his wife and their young daughter. They go to stay in an Airbnb in the mountains in Germany. He is a screenwriter, and they go away so he can take some time to get some work done. When they get there, he realizes that something is not quite right. The rooms aren't where he remembers them being, and there are sentences in his journal that he does not remember writing. The whole book is written in the form of his journal, which I really enjoyed the way it was written. This book is only tiny, and reading this in one sitting was such a surreal experience. It's so tense and anxiety inducing and confusing. It makes you feel like you are losing your own mind alongside the main character. This book really blurs your sense of reality, and it is written, I feel like, in quite short, snappy sentences, which creates this anxiety inducing tension. Because it is written in the form of the main character's journal, the whole story then becomes unreliable. It is the perfect book to read completely on your own on a dark evening when it's raining outside with the lights dim. You will feel scared and confused and every other emotion at the same time. This is kind of part horror, part science fiction. It is a blend of everything, and I can't believe I didn't read this sooner. I absolutely loved it and highly recommend it. If you're a fan of the author Ian Reid, who wrote Foe and wrote We Spread and I'm Thinking of Ending Things, I think you will also absolutely love this. My other favourite book I read this month was Our Spoons Came from Walworth by Barbara Cummins. She is probably my favourite author of all time at this point. I absolutely love everything I've read from her. Absolutely nothing happens in this book. This is about a young couple who are in poverty. They have a young child they are trying to raise. They are trying to just exist and get through each day at a time. They dream of a better life, but it feels so far away. The main character, Sophia, is only 21 when her and Charles get married, so she's experiencing all of this so young. She doesn't particularly want to be with her husband as time goes on, but they are stuck in a depression economically and mentally, and it feels like there is no chance to escape. There isn't a plot to this, it is musings of a mundane life. But Barbara Cummins is an absolute genius at making the mundane so much more interesting and compelling. Every word she writes is so intentional. I loved every second I spent with Sophia and Charles in this book. And even though there is no plot, I wish this was a series and I could just carry on reading about their lives because I'm just so invested in them. Barbara Cummins is also very witty and very funny, very dry humour. At one point in this, the character refers to someone else as having a face like cheap, melting strawberry ice cream. Barbara Cummins' books are often filled with tragedy and trauma, but she brings a comedic light to them and tries to find joy in these small mundane things. And I love her as a writer so much. I loved this book, and I only have a few of her books left that I've not read yet, so I'm trying to savour them because when I've read them all, I will have none left, as she is sadly no longer with us, so I need to take my time with them, but I'm so eager to get to more. I read one non-fiction book in April, and that was Pinkp by Lois Shearing. This is about how women are recruited into the far right, the reasons why they join, the reasons why they stay, are there any benefits to it? This was so interesting. The reason why I picked this up was because quite a while ago now, me and my friend Rachel went on a trip to Oxford, and when we were in the Blackwells, they had a poster for an event for this book. We obviously hadn't read it, but we could see what it was about and thought it sounded really interesting. So we went along to the event to hear the author discuss it, and it was one of the best book events I've ever been to. It was such a great conversation between the whole audience and the author and the interviewer. So I immediately picked it up afterwards, and it is one of the best nonfiction books I've read in a while. Generally, when we think of the far right and we think of people who have been radicalized, we think of men and we think of young boys, and we usually neglect the fact that women are also a part of this. Young girls are also recruited into these groups, and we need to understand why, because naturally, far right groups do not benefit women in any way, shape, or form. They are extremely misogynistic. They think women shouldn't have any autonomy over their own body. So we wonder, why would a woman choose to join such a group that discriminates them and ostracizes them? There must be some reason why. The only way we can begin to fight back against these movements and stop more women joining them is to understand why they are joining them, and that is what this book tries to explore. It looks in modern society, online propaganda on social media, into things such as the trad wife movement and why that's becoming more popular, but it also looks back in history and how women were still very prevalent in far right groups. They were doing the admin, they were doing the labor behind the scenes. And there were so many things in this book that I hadn't even thought of, hadn't even crossed my mind. This book is very complex. There's a lot of information to consume. It's definitely one to take your time with, but I think it's a really important book. I think everyone should be reading it, and I think we need more literature on this topic. If you know me, I am a short book girly. I very rarely read super long books, but I really fancied this month getting a long book to sink my teeth into and get invested in. And I asked on my Instagram story for long book recommendations, and probably over half of the responses were The Reformatory by Tananarive Due. I've previously read The Between by Tananarive Due, which is a book I absolutely love and would highly recommend. So the fact that everyone was recommending this, I thought I'm probably going to love it as well. I forgot I actually already owned a copy that the publisher sent me quite some time ago. So I read this month. This was 600 pages. This is about a family where the young boy ends up in a bit of a kerfuffle with a white boy and gets sentenced in court for it and gets sent to the Reformatory, which is like a big school for naughty boys. But it is more like a prison. He's sentenced to go to this school for 6 months, and his older sister is devastated. She's desperate for him to escape. The warden of this school is extremely sadistic, is extremely violent, physically harms the black boys that are at this school, and he has no remorse for anything that he does. He's extremely twisted. Our main character, Robert, who is a young boy at this school, realizes he can actually see ghosts. They are referred to in this book as haints. He begins communicating with them, and he realizes he might be able to use them to help him escape this school earlier. I obviously liked this book because if I didn't, I would not have read all 600 pages. I would have gave up. I enjoyed the time spent with the characters. It was very entertaining. However, this has such a high average rating on Goodreads. I think it has like a 4.45 rating, which is super high if you know Goodreads. And every single person I follow who has read this has rated it 5 stars. And for me, I did really enjoy it, but I would probably give it like 3 stars, max 3.5. Like I said, I did enjoy it. It was entertaining. I became invested in the characters' lives. However, it really wasn't mind blowing for me. It didn't feel like anything new. The Between by Tananarive Due has the same kind of racial commentary that this book has in a more modern setting, because this is set in the 1950s. But The Between was so much more tense and creepy and scary and stressful, and just an overall much, much better book, in my opinion. I read Time of the Flies by Claudia Pinheiro, who is the author of Elena Knows and A Little Luck, which are two books I absolutely love. I love this author. I even have a tattoo of Elena Knows because I loved that book so much. So I finally got around to this, but this book is very different to her two other books that have been translated. Her other books are literary fiction, quite poignant, quite lyrical, quite powerful, quite emotional, whereas this is more of a thriller. This is about Inez, who murdered her husband's lover and is now being released from prison 15 years later, and she starts a business with her friend. But the business has two halves. Her friend is a private detective, whereas our main character, Inez, is pest control. Our main character is paid to go around to people's houses and fumigate them from bugs and insects. And one day she goes to a client, and the woman asks her if she will do her a favour. She has heard about who she is and what she went to prison for, and she would like to pay her a lot of money to get rid of someone. Inez is estranged from her daughter, and one day when she sees her daughter show up at this client's house, she realises everything is not what it seems. Although this is technically what you would call a thriller, it is also a commentary on feminism and loyalty within friendships and the strain on blood familial bonds and how much choice we have in our lives. Because this is Claudia Pinheiro, not a typical thriller, it is more literary. There is much more of a character study. We get so much more background on the characters rather than it being a super plot twist heavy suspenseful story. I did really enjoy this. I think if you're a fan of her other books, you will enjoy it as well. However, because it is such a departure from her other work, it is so different to her two other books that have been translated. I didn't love it as much. It didn't have that emotional impact for me. The other two books made me shed a tear, but this one was much more of an entertaining book. I still recommend it. I still loved it, but it is just so different from her work. This is actually, by the way, technically a sequel in a series, but the first book is not translated into English, I believe, or it was years ago and is now out of print or something like that. However, this can be read as a standalone, hence it has been republished as a standalone. But I would be very intrigued to be able to go back and read the book that is meant to be prior to this one. I read a short story collection from Camilla Sosa Valada, who is the author of Bad Girls. This collection is called I'm a Fool to Want You, and it is translated by Kit Maud. I liked this. However, I need to do some digging and find out whether this was in its original language published or written before Bad Girls, because I read Bad Girls and loved it. However, so many of the stories in this collection felt like a repeat of Bad Girls or like a first draft of Bad Girls. So, although I enjoyed the collection, it did feel very repetitive and a little bit dull, like it was almost like I'd read it before because of how similar it was to Bad Girls, which I guess would make sense if this was written first. In a similar vein to Sayaka Murata, Life Ceremony was one of her most recent publications translated into English. However, it was actually written before her other books, I believe. So some of the stories in Life Ceremony feel very similar to Earthlings and Convenience Store Woman because they were wrote first. I think if you've not read from this author before, this would be a good place to start to give you a vibe of what her writing style is like. She has a great imagination. Her writing is very impactful and powerful. However, if you've already read Bad Girls, I don't really feel like you need to pick this one up, to be honest. I feel like if you read this one first, you could then still go and read Bad Girls and enjoy it, because Bad Girls would be a more extended version of some of these stories. However, reading them the other way around, I felt like didn't work. Years late to the party, I know, but I finally read No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai, and I think I had very wrong expectations going into this. For some reason, I was under the impression this book was going to be super weird and crazy and bizarre, when actually it is more bleak and depressing and dark. The protagonist of this book is living what would be considered a normal life. However, he feels like he does not understand humans at all and feels like he doesn't belong to humankind. To kind of cope with this, when he is a young child at school, he becomes the class clown. To prevent everyone else from taking the mickey out of him for being different, he tries to get in there first and acts as the joker and the silly one. But eventually, later down the line, further in life, he succumbs to very dark times and depression and wanting to not be here anymore. I liked this, and I've already picked up The Setting Sun by Osamu Dazai because I'm excited to read more from him. I do think I would have enjoyed this more if I went into it blind or read up on it a bit more to kind of set my expectations a bit more accurately. I read A Perfect Day to Be Alone, which is a tiny little, very quiet Japanese novel about a young girl who leaves her family home and she goes to live with an elderly lady who is a bit of a crazy cat lady. She wants kind of independence and she gets part-time jobs and she meets new people and wants to make friends, really struggles with romantic relationships. This is a very sweet and pleasant book, and the main character does obviously eventually build a little bit of a bond with this elderly lady, despite kind of resenting her in the beginning. This didn't feel like anything new to me. There are quite a lot of quiet, pleasant, sweet Japanese novellas, and this one kind of blended into the rest of them for me, sadly. I read Someone to Watch Over You, which is another short Japanese novella, and this is set during the coronavirus pandemic, which felt very surreal to be reading about, as if it was like a long time ago. Follow two lonely people who find themselves stuck in a house together and forming a strange connection. One of them bears the burden of potentially causing a protester's death, and the other person worries that her behaviour led to one of her students taking their own life. The story questions, as the world kind of crashes and ends and spirals around them, can they find refuge and peace with each other? The story is actually quite simple and mundane, but as lots of these Pushkin Press Japanese novellas do, it has a just element of strangeness to it, an element of peculiarity. Nothing in particular crazy happens, but the characters behave and talk in slightly odd ways. It really explores how, when we're put in strange circumstances, how we can develop connections with people and how unlikely friendships can be, but can actually do so much good for us. The characters in this book don't necessarily actually spend a whole lot of time together, or at least quality time together, but they kind of dwell in their loneliness together, which brings them company, brings them peace from the outside world. I enjoyed this book, but it's not a new favourite. I think I gave it 3 stars. In the same vein as a lot of Japanese novellas, the writing style can be very succinct, to the point, matter of fact. It's not very poetic or metaphorical, but this still had some very tender moments, and I was drawn in straight away. If you're looking for something that's a quick read, this is definitely one. I read Nevada by Imogen Binney, and this follows a young trans woman named Maria who ends her relationship and embarks on a road trip. And along this road trip, she meets a young man called James who she forms a connection with. Maria is generally quite confident as a trans woman, but does grapple with romantic relationships, finds it hard to open up to people, finds it hard to commit to people. And then she meets James in the supermarket where he works. She can tell from a distance that he is potentially dealing with some struggles with his gender identity, and she kind of comes to help him. I don't necessarily think this story is anything groundbreaking on its own. However, I think it is a book that has to be taken with the context of when it was written. It was published in 2013, so 12 years ago. At the time, there were definitely much less trans authors being published and trans people publishing books about their trans experience. So at the time, I think this would have been kind of revolutionary. I think that in itself makes it a very special book. Tori Peters, the author of The Transition Baby, has quoted on the back saying this book launched the trans writing scene, and that is definitely a huge compliment to Imogen Binney. The main character, Maria, definitely isn't a perfect person. She makes mistakes in her life. She treats people not so nicely sometimes and messes up, but she's such a charming and charismatic character that even though does make these mistakes, you feel so much love for her and you are invested in her future. She's also very funny. She originally, in the beginning of the book, works in a bookstore, but she is so laissez-faire about her work ethic, and I just found that hilarious to read, and I think it's something we can all relate to. I read The Nothing by Hanif Qureshi, who is an author I've read one book from previously, which was Intimacy, which I really liked. Intimacy gets quite negative reviews on places like Goodreads, but I loved it. This book, however, is about a man who is a wheelchair user and he's cared for by his wife. However, he believes that one of his close friends that visits them quite often is actually having an affair with his wife and he is losing her. He is determined to prove his suspicions and then take on revenge. This book is very tense and uncomfortable at times, and Hanif Qureshi generally is great at writing about things that people don't talk about or feel uncomfortable discussing. The main character has this sense of helplessness and hopelessness because he's losing his wife and he feels like there isn't necessarily anything he can do about it, but at the same time he's such a strong and feisty person. The book doesn't particularly have a conclusion. It doesn't really go anywhere. It was a point of view that I've not really read from before, so that was interesting. Basically, the whole book takes place in their small home in his room, just one room. And I think that really adds to the darkness and helplessness of the story. Finally, I read Notes of a Crocodile. I read a book from this author previously called Last Words of Montmartre, and I loved it. It was one of the most stunning pieces of writing I've ever read. This is a little bit different. This is a queer coming of age story about a group of misfit university students. At the same time of these events, there is also another part of reality where crocodiles are kind of turned into human form and are walking the earth and going into shops and talking to people and reading books, and there is a frenzy about them in the media, and that part definitely had a deeper meaning to it, but I just don't think I was in the right headspace to read this book when I read it. I think I was misunderstanding a lot and a lot was going over my head, and I think it is one that I will revisit and reread at another point in life because I know I love this author and I know a lot of people love this book, and maybe it just isn't for me. I think it might be one that I will love more if I were to read it just at a different point in time. I would love to know what your guys' favourite book and least favourite book of April were, so please let me know in the comments. Let me know what you thought of any of these books if you've read them, or if you've maybe read any of these this month as well, and I will see